landlord just came to me and he said to me that the city has bought the property and I had to move. So I'm like, okay, so when do I have to move? And it was like, hey, you have to move like soon as possible.
It went from a neighborhood that was lively throughout the summer, spring, winter, and fall, highly dense neighborhood. Now it's just low residents, high vacancies, and a lot of blight.
It's not difficult for wealthy people to move into this community. It will be difficult for poor people to move into the community when it's revitalized, right? So what they really mean is they want to create a community where wealthy people would want to be.
I lived at 1132 West Saratoga Street. My mom lived there for like over 30 years. So after she passed away, I took over the house. And me and the landlord discussed on me buying the house. It has a lot of sentimentals in it. My mom lived there. We was pretty much kids raised up around the neighborhood and raised there. And he said to me that the city has bought the property and I had to move. So I'm like, okay, so when do I have to move? And it was like, hey, you have to move like soon as possible. I slept in my truck with my kids for maybe about almost a month or so. Then I got up enough money to get a hotel room. So I got a hotel room and I put me and my kids lived in a hotel room for a couple months for there and everything. I mean, it was hard. It was truly hard. Losing that house down there, it took so much from me. It took so much from my children. It took more from me because, like I said, I was a breadwinner. It took everything from me. And every morning, every day I wake up, I try to figure out what am I going to do today to survive? How is today is going to be for me? What happens tomorrow? I'm living for the day, but what happens tomorrow? What happens when this landlord here goes up on his rent and I can't afford what I have now?
Yeah, I'm Nicole King. I'm a professor of American Studies at UMBC, and I study place, power, economic development, and do cultural documentation projects in Baltimore with the Baltimore Traces Project. It looks at how Baltimore neighborhoods change over time and then tries to center what residents, people who live and work in the neighborhoods, how they feel about those changes. So we've been working very closely with people who are, being displaced due to eminent domain, which is the process of where the state can take private property for a public use. And it's used oftentimes in cities like Baltimore, historic cities experiencing deindustrialization or depopulation, and a decline in the tax income base. Eminent domain is used to kind of clear properties and offer them for outside developers to come and kind of re-envision a neighborhood. And that's kind of what's happened somewhat here in Poppleton.
And I think that's what they do. I think they go through these neighborhoods where low-income families are. And once you lose your house, they scoop in, they buy it or whatever. They don't give you a chance to try to keep it or help build the community back up. They just come and scoop it up so that they can do their $1 million developments and everything else. And then they do their $1 million developments, and that only lasts for a couple of years.
So the development project has been a long project, and to talk about it, it kind of began with a request for proposals in 2004. The city took 526 properties in Poppleton. They owned 300 and something of those properties, but 169 they needed to take by eminent domain. And out of those, 130 were occupied. So that is 130 people's homes were kind of offered as part of this large kind of plot of land. It's 13.8 acres to developers. So many different developers bid on the project, and the one that ended up was La Cité, which is a development company out of New York City led by the Bythewood family. So that began in 2004, and then the city essentially began the process of using eminent domain, different public funds to relocate residents. So then by 2017, a plan for 2 luxury apartment buildings, and those had some problems being built. There were some water issues, but they eventually opened in 2019, and the Center West apartment buildings were built. And then that brings us to 2020 when there started to be another wave of displacing residents who were in kind of the later phase.
So I'm Curtis Eady. I'm here, 4th generation resident here in Baltimore, here in Palperton neighborhood. And behind me we have the Center West development, which this development has been, it's like a good and bad thing here in the community. I say really good because we need development. This is one of the first red line neighborhoods, Baltimore City being one of the first red line cities in America. This neighborhood being west of downtown, despite it being a neighborhood of survivors, and we haven't really been thriving here. So I've seen the decline of the neighborhood. I've seen the families being pushed out. It went from a neighborhood that was lively throughout the summer, spring, winter, and fall, highly dense neighborhood. Now it's just low residents, high vacancies, and a lot of blight. And most of it is done because of the development that's here behind us.
The apartments, for good, have 20% affordable housing. So they're 80% market rate, 20% affordable. So the pricing of these apartments seemed a bit high for the neighborhood, because what the development does in the 20% affordable is based on AMI, the area median income, which includes Towson, includes parts of Howard County and Baltimore County, it includes the metro area. So that is around $90,000. But if you look at the actual median income of people who live in Poppleton, that is, below $40,000 a year. It's somewhere like $24,000 a year in that specific neighborhood. So if you go and you look at this luxury apartment building in the middle of public housing, it is a little off.
Oh, of course. They know black people is not going to be able to afford that straight off the bat. I'm sorry to say it, and that's something I was trying to avoid. But okay, we're not going to avoid the question. Black people is not going to be able to afford living down there anymore. So black people down there now, even those who think that their houses is safe because they own their house. You don't own the land. You don't own the property. You just own the house. So, okay, we're going to take your house from you because you don't own this land. So we're going to buy your land. It's just like the Indians. We're going to take the land and we're going to put you wherever you want to go. We're just going to put you we're just going to put you out of sight.
These kinds of development projects can perpetuate racial inequality. So it really depends on how the development is going to treat the existing community. If it is going to displace the community, and then we have to follow those residents to where they land to see if they end up in better or worse circumstances. But the continual whole-scale movement of African Americans out of existing neighborhoods and across the city, that continual displacement is a harm, both social, as a social harm, a psychological harm to existing residents, and it continues to make African American populations vulnerable to sort of the developmental winds, if you will, of elected officials.
But this is not happening to all minorities. It's just happening to black people. Like it's like we're nobody to them, as if we don't exist to them, like we don't deserve them. They treat us like we don't deserve anything, as if they hate us enough that they don't mind throwing shit in our face and like take this and be happy. I don't get that. Like, what is it so bad about black people that you hate so much that you just can't help ourselves?
I don't know whether or not developers are thinking about alternative models, and I don't have an alternative model necessarily to propose, but I would love to see developers and city officials think more about the ways in which new development can incorporate existing communities. So in a city such as Baltimore with a declining population, we have the space to incorporate new people and new developments. But there are always valuable things in existing neighborhoods that the existing residents value and that we as a city ought to value. And so I think it is not unreasonable to ask developers to think about how those things can be honored and incorporated into their development projects rather than whole scale removed.
And so that's a different model that we're trying to move towards, I think, in Baltimore. In this development, there could be a great potential for it to shift and to center residents to stop displacement right now, and to work together to have a more kind of community-led development project. But that's me being optimistic. Really, the question is, because of how Baltimore is set up, the mayor has a great deal of power. the question isn't if he could do it, it's does he have the political will to do it. It's going to be difficult. Some people might make less money, but those people are pretty wealthy to begin with. So I think that's an important thing to call on the mayor to really put his money where his mouth is, or, you know, to use more cliches, to not just talk the talk but walk the walk.
But the comeback I often get when I talk about citizen engaged decision making is that citizens don't want to be involved. And it's a fallacy. I don't buy it. It just means we're really lazy. And whether it's city government, state government, we can be really lazy about reaching out to citizens. We think a survey is reaching out to citizens. It is not. It's door-to-door knocking. It's having town hall meetings where citizens have the opportunity to speak up and not just get information.
I would want the developers to make us a part of the decision. You know, just make, that's all we ask. Stop acting like we're invisible. We're not invisible. Maybe we don't have as much as they have, and we're like little peas in a pond. But we are that community. They don't know nothing about the community. They just know they just found a piece of property where they can make millions of dollars in. But in there, millions of dollars in it, they just took away a lot.
And I think no resident of Poppleton is against development. I think what they're against is development with displacement, and what they're for is community-led development, especially with the immense amount of public funds that has been invested in this development, that it's not just a private developer coming in with his or her money doing a project.
Recently I've been seeing how the city has been praising the developer. He's been news in the newspaper, he's been on WBAL News, just all these different places about what he's doing. And his argument, he says that he's saving the community, and he's the reason why crime has gone down, and he's the reason why opportunity is starting to grow. But again, just showing people how home ownership was here. You know, we had active schools. This lot was being used full time for sports engagement. We had a farm that was ran by residents.
I don't know where my future lies. I really don't. I totally don't. I don't even know. Do I have a future? I can say I'm gonna tell you what my future is. What I see in my future. I see my future as having a house, just like everybody else. Having a house, owning a house, you know, being able to come home and not worry about nobody putting me out unless I chose to be put out.
Okay, it begins with my dad seeing my growing family, outgrowing a home that we were living in, and decided when our family passed in this house that the house was up for sale, and he came and he purchased the house for me in 1992. Came down here, we was able to look the house, and it just had so much potential. And that's what we saw. Doing upgrades and, you know, remodeling the house. And it became home. You know, the people in the block, my kids got to meet, you know, the other kids in the block. And it became a family location again. And something that I was really in search of, because where we were living, it was more secluded.
I think the characterization that there's this white, you know, Baltimore that's free of crime and free of drugs is a false narrative. And I think that the idea that the black Baltimore is just completely crime-ridden, right, and just so destitute. Rather, both communities have cultural aspects that are amazing and filled with people with great resources, both socially and culturally. I think that what we're really seeing is hyper-segregation of communities that face cumulative disadvantage.
In November 12th of 2012, we had a house fire. And during the house fire, we lost everything. And the devastation was to come through the door, and it's like, this is not my home. I can't enter this place. It's not me. It's not mine any longer. But my husband, you know, was assuring me that you can do it. You know, we can rebuild it. We can do it. And we went and applied for permits, and we was So we couldn't get permits because the house had been condemned. And we went up to housing. We were sent upstairs to housing. They said that this development, wasn't moving forward. It was just in a standstill position, and they didn't know if it was going to move forward or not. So they released our permits. We came in, did a gut out, and was able to put the house back together to my liking. We did design plans, we did the work, and we did everything, and to make this our home again. In 2015, we went to get our occupancy to move back in, and I would say just a few weeks later, we learned that the development was moving forward and that hearings were beginning, and that we were still now put back in that same predicament that we were before the fire. So I was just back in the fight again. And I've been fighting to have my property removed from this list since 2004. Well, I received a summons of condemnation in February of last year, which was 2020. And that was the first real notification that I have received on condemnation.
Right now we are at Sarah Ann Street and Carrollton Avenue. So behind me are the Sarah Ann Street houses. You see these colorful houses. They've been colorful houses almost since their building. I believe it goes back to 80s or the 70s since these houses have been painted multiple colors. This is said to be the first settlement of free slaves here in Baltimore from the Carroll Park Mansion and or plantation. So the history here, this whole block has already been set, it was preserved up until 2021. So every 10 years, I believe, you're supposed to re-sign to get reapproval for the historic designation. That's only with the eminent domain and urban renewal law. So the urban renewal law is actually jeopardizing this sacred land and these historic houses. Now, not only is this plot historic, but the city tried to say that the properties weren't built until 1930, 1920. The rest of the properties at Carrollton Avenue, which those properties go back to the 1800s as well.
So I think it's a great plan what he's doing. It brought the market values up in our community. He was the only one that paid for Sarah Ann Street to be not torn down. Yes. So they got it all wrong. If you look in that's all public records. Sarah Ann Street was never gonna, he the one made it historical. He paid for it to be historical. Sarah Ann Street, yes.
From Bill Henry, our comptroller, a couple of months ago, that the developer it's up to the developer to give back the land because the land was promised to him. It's not up to the city because they made an agreement. So it's up to the developer. So if the developer says he don't need the land or don't want he's not requiring the land, then the city don't have to demolish the house. So they don't have to acquire the property because they don't have to give him the land. So this is what we just learned. And the comptroller also said that this developer is not willing to give it up without a cost.
So we don't know exactly when. Right now we're fighting. Thanks to the support of community members like Nicole King, and there's a couple other organizational groups who actually came out to help get us nationally registered. So historic registration will help protect these properties from highway construction and new development, future development, but we're trying to find a way of designation to protect them from urban development as well, so not just highways. So the highway to nowhere that came in, they didn't have any protection. They was able to remove 900 homes, over 6,000 families. Here, if we don't protect it, then About 11 houses, I think 12 houses, as well as just the families that's already been displaced. So right now we're trying to fight and save the 12 houses and rehab them so that families can move back for home ownership. So that's the goal, and we'll hopefully have the designation in for historic to keep it and preserve it by the end of this year.
Of course he is. Of course. He's not making anyone move. Take that up with the city, because it's not him that's doing this. And if you're talking about Miss Sonia Eddings, she's only one person on the block. And all those houses are condemned, ma'am. Have you been around there? Have you seen it?
It was never a one house. And that's the confusion. It's just that we're the only ones left. So this is what they're looking at, like, why don't you just give in like everybody else? Sonia, why is you holding up the process? You know, why don't you just go ahead and give this man your house? That's the way that Paulette and others are looking at it. But they're not looking at all of the 100+ people who were already displaced, who did not want to go, who did not voluntarily say, here, take my house. And I think this neighborhood helped to shape me and mold me, and gave me insight, you know, and I'm really grateful. You know, I think I wouldn't have done it any different. I'm grateful that my dad saw this as a place that will be good for me and my family, you know, and I love it here.
So each generation, history repeats itself. And when it repeats itself, it takes a different turn. So right now, you are the big developments that's going around and removing people from their neighborhood and houses. So guess what? Your generation down the line might take that turn, and somebody on this side of the cake of the wall of this generation might take the turn. So you'll be me and I'll be you. So it means that I am you and you are me.